Well, thank you for that introduction, Johanna, and good morning to everyone. I was asked to give an overview, and I sort of feel like Nick Wallenda, who was in the news last few days for walking across the Chicago River. I'm going to stay on a fairly narrow path and not step into the territory that the following speakers are going to cover. So I was asked to let you know, I'm a federal employee, so there's a room full of ethics officers making sure I don't have any financial conflicts. And I don't have any relevant disclosures as well, other than my own personal biases, which you'll hear about in the next 25 minutes. So you'll see here that our elderly population has increased really dramatically over the last 100 years or so, and the projection for the next 50 years, or 30 years actually, is to increase far more proportionally than we've seen. And so if you think Social Security is in trouble now, just wait a few years. And why is that important? It's because older people have increased medical costs. And you'll see the bottom line here is people in the first decade over 65 years of age, medical costs over 75, and then it really jumps up to about $20,000 a year per person for people over the age of 85. And this actually is the number of chronic conditions that Medicare recipients are being treated for. So the proportion of over 65s in this country who have one or no chronic conditions is about 30%. That means 2/3 of the population has multiple chronic conditions they're being treated for, which is quite a discouraging statistic. In preparing for this talk, I was actually not able to find a lot of age-specific data from the federal government on disability. There's a lot of data on disability among the adult population. So here we have causes of death, and I've highlighted those in red as also leading causes of disability. I've excluded cancer as a cause of disability. It can be, but I don't think it's actually one of the major causes. So heart disease, when I was a student, heart disease accounted for more than all other deaths combined. It was 52 to 54% of the total deaths in the US 40 years ago. Now it's around 28%. Chronic respiratory disease, significant cause of disability in this country, primarily attributable to use of tobacco. Stroke has similar pathogenesis to heart disease, Alzheimer's disease. Again, the working definition of Alzheimer's has changed over the last 30, 40 years, that essentially all forms of senility are now lumped into Alzheimer's, and much of that is due to cardiovascular disease, primarily in carotid arteries. Diabetes also contributes to cardiovascular disease. Atherosclerosis, primarily disease of the large arteries. Diabetes affects the small arteries equally to the large arteries. Kidney disease, and then finally unintentional injuries, which we'll talk about in a moment. And there's a significant diet effect for a lot of these things. There's a lot of evidence, which I'm not going to go into very much in the course of my talk, other than a few specific examples. But cardiovascular disease clearly has a strong dietary effect. Cancer, there's a minor effect. Respiratory disease, a minor diet effect, but there is a benefit. And in fact, we had studies on beta-carotene supplements years and years ago based on the fact that people with higher baseline levels of carotenoids had less risk of lung cancer and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Controlled studies have not borne out what the observational studies have found. Even though Alzheimer's can be partially attributable to cardiovascular complications. There's really an unknown dietary effect on Alzheimer's as an entire entity. Diabetes strongly affected by diet. Kidney disease, there's some diet effect, particularly once kidney disease has been established, but not so much is known about the pathogenesis of kidney disease. So again, data from the federal government on adults over the age of 65 with moderate to severe functional limitations, and about a third of the population claims, self-reports moderate to severe limitations. And the darker blue here is in 2007, the lighter blue bars 2011. So we want these bars to get shorter. The target was 26% of the population, so the bars should move to the left, and you'll look for whatever demographic group is summarized here. The bars in 2011 have moved to the right in the wrong direction. So a higher proportion of the population reporting significant functional limitations. One of the things that surprised me is CDC tells us that 1 in 3 adults over the age of 65 falls each and every year. And about a fifth to a third of them suffer moderate to severe injuries as a result of that. And as people age, there's significant injuries that are associated with that. There's a decline in health, and there's hospitalizations, nursing home institutionalizations as a result of that. So it's the leading cause of injury deaths in the elderly population. It's the most common cause of non-fatal injuries and hospitalizations due to trauma. However, the age-adjusted incidence of hip fractures has not increased. The population, as you saw from one of Johanna's introductory slides, has expanded considerably. So we have a lot more population in that category, a lot more fractures. But one of the issues that has been documented is that there's a fear of falling among the elderly. And Dr. Ferrucci gave us his runway walk of why elderly fall and why they're afraid of falling. And that limits activities by the elderly, reduces their mobility, loss of physical fitness, which increases their risk of falling. There's a vicious cycle there. If you've read papers, particularly review papers on diet and aging, you've seen a graphic somewhat similar to this, where there are multiple components that contribute to healthy aging in addition to the diet. There's the genetic input, there's being productive, there's physical activity, there's social linkages. And I've added a few at the top here, outside of these spheres of influence on healthy aging that determine how well people age. And in fact, being wealthy is really useful for healthy aging. And in fact, that determines your social activity, your productive pursuits, the quality of your diet. It determines your physical environment. It determines the health and social services that are available to you. It determines your educational status. It determines cultural factors. So we're probably not, considering that the Republicans now control both houses of Congress, we're probably not going to change economic determinants too readily. But in fact, giving people dietary advice or handing out dollar bills might be equally effective. Since I am from the federal government, one of my other part-time jobs is being co-chair of the Federal Dietary Reference Intake Steering Committee. So I felt a need to talk about the DRIs for a couple of minutes. These are set by expert committees contracted from the federal government to the Institute of Medicine. And they're set for specific age and gender groups, and I don't need to read all of the lists to you, but there are for different ages in infants, children, and adults. And despite the multiple categories of adults that are here and the single grouping for adults over the age of 70, hardly anything in nutrition research is studied for requirements in that age group. Almost everything is extrapolated from young adults. So we have DRIs for macro and micronutrients, for water. There is a DRI for total calories based on the estimated energy requirement. That's extremely controversial, probably overestimates that requirement significantly. There is no adjustment for age or muscle mass in the older population. And so I went through the charts for the DRIs recently and looked for what nutrients have different values in older adults, and there are very few. Basically, at the age of 70, there's an increase in calcium, there's a decrease in vitamin B requirement, decreases in iron, chromium, and dietary fiber based on a lower caloric requirement, and that's it. So we don't have a lot of solid information on that. But we're told, you know, if we eat better, if we behave better, we're going to have years of useful, productive life beyond that. So here's the geriatrician telling his patient, remember the 20 extra years you added to your life through clean, healthy living? Well, these are them. And this is part of the problem, that we can't guarantee for an individual that they're going to benefit from our advice, which is not necessarily based on solid data at this point. A lot of it's based on wishful thinking or observational studies, which do not prove causality. So I want to talk about cardiovascular disease. As I mentioned earlier, it remains the leading cause of morbidity and mortality in the older population, and disability in particular is a result of congestive heart failure. With medication today, people can survive many, many years with CHF. Renal disease, also a result of principally from atherosclerosis, other vascular problems. And there are major risk factors for that. They're all listed here again. Genetics plays a significant role. And it's actually quite difficult to assess the quantitative contribution of these risk factors to the end-stage disease. But I can tell you that elevated LDL cholesterol has been estimated by statisticians from the National Center for Health Statistics to contribute about 20% of the total risk for heart disease. Now, if you watch television, you've all seen the commercials for statins, which are going to cure you of heart disease. And this is part of the problem, that it's a multifactorial, multi-stage disease, and we're looking for a single change to make. And that's ludicrous. We need to intervene at multiple steps in the etiological pathway. One of the things that is not well appreciated is that there's significant regional differences in the United States for most chronic diseases, whether it's causes of mortality or causes of disability. And this is a map showing congestive heart failure in the U.S., just mortality. I don't have a similar map for disability, but if mortality is significantly different across the country, you would expect disability to the disease to be following in that pattern. Really what's important is the key down here. And you can see there's more than a twofold, almost a threefold difference from the lowest states in the light colors to the highest states in the dark colors. And it's really interesting to see from West Virginia down through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, this pattern is identical for high body mass index, for cigarette smoking, for not using seat belts in automobiles. A lot of risk factors are parallel in these geographic areas, and in fact, the income in these areas is significantly lower than others. Education levels significantly lower. There's a constellation of habits that coexist. Hypertension is a significant issue in the United States. Men shown in blue here, women in red. And what's interesting in the elderly population is the majority of Americans have high blood pressure. And we have a lot of drugs now that effectively treat high blood pressure, but it is amenable to dietary intervention as well. I'm not a true believer in the specific recommendations for sodium reduction. I think they're very controversial. I do believe that obesity significantly contributes to hypertension, but we don't have particularly good evidence in the elderly population of the relative contributions of risk factors to hypertension. When I was in school, I was taught that the eye ages faster than any other organ. And I'm not sure if that's because we can see it and quantitate it non-invasively, but both the lens and the back of the eye, the retina, have significant diseases that contribute to vision problems. This is wet macular degeneration, those yellow spots in the retina. And they both contribute to limitations on mobility, and that's why they're significant in disability. So the prevalence rates for cataract, again, you can see these are different ethnic groups in the U.S., and the white population is in blue with the diamonds. They have the highest prevalence, and then the non-white groups here. Again, you'll see that in the elderly population, the majority of Americans are going to end up with a cataract. And not nearly the same percentage for AMD, but again, over the age of 70, there starts to be a significant increase, and it's primarily in the Caucasian population, with a huge jump over the age of 80 to about 14% prevalence. And this is the leading cause of blindness in the elderly. So there have been some nutritional interventions, the AREDS studies, age-related eye disease studies sponsored by NIH. There have been 2 of them, and it's in subjects with high risk of advanced AMD. So they've already had AMD in one or both eyes. And the initial study on the left was done in the 1990s using a combination supplement, high-dose vitamin C, vitamin E, beta-carotene, a whopping dose of zinc, and some copper because zinc and copper offset each other. There was a 25% reduction in the progression of AMD over 5 years, but no decrease in the onset of the incidence of AMD in this population. And then this was followed up a few years later by AREDS 2, similar subject characteristics with pre-existing disease in one eye. And they added on or subtracted from the original AREDS 1 supplements. So they added lutein and zeaxanthine, they added fish oil, and they reduced the zinc concentration in multiple combinations with or without the original. And there was really no benefits from these new additions in over 4,000 subjects. But interestingly, the removal of beta-carotene had no effect on the incidence of macular degeneration. So these are the strongest data we have that there's nutritional intervention. And a 25% reduction is nothing to sneeze at, that it's beneficial for that number, but it also means that the majority of patients don't benefit from this intervention over the time that we're talking about. Obesity contributes to disability in a variety of ways. It's probably the biggest factor impairing glucose tolerance and the significant increase in type 2 diabetes that we've experienced over the last 20, 30 years in this country. In the general population, there's about a 9% prevalence, but in the elderly, there's a 26% prevalence of type 2 diabetes. So double to triple the incidence as people age. There's wear and tear on leg joints. I actually had seen 3 or 4-year-old numbers from CDC, and then I found 2-year-old numbers, and it's just amazing. There's 1 million joint replacements a year in this country, primarily due to excess weight. Huge cost, a lot of disability as a result of that. Obesity contributes to an impaired quality of life. People just unable to walk distances. I work in a large federal building that you basically have to drive to get there. And so there's a parking lot that must hold 800 cars and huge number of handicap spaces. And from personal observation, I can tell you that almost everybody who parks in the handicap spaces is obese and is unable to walk as a result of that. People are tired from that. Obesity factors into cardiovascular disease, cancer, immune dysfunction. But paradoxically, there's increased survival in people with higher BMIs, not in the very obese, but clearly in the categories that we acknowledge are overweight. Immunity and inflammation you've heard about. Older people are particularly susceptible to infectious diseases. They have a reduced ability to respond to infectious agents. They don't respond particularly well to vaccinations, even though that's one of the targets for the federal government to vaccinate more elderly people. So what's associated with normal aging? People who are more physically active, people who have residual muscle strength, people who can think clearly, people who have a higher body mass index, people who report that they're in good health, people who have higher hemoglobin and higher serum cholesterol, no matter what NIH says, and lower creatinine values. I needed to add a slide yesterday or the day before that I sent to Heather. This paper appeared online last week. It's in press with the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This is from the Nurses' Health Study. So it's a subset of the 120,000 nurses who had a food frequency questionnaire filled out in the 1980s twice, survived to 70 years of age with no major chronic disease, no impairments, major impairments of cognitive or physical function or mental health. And of that group, only 11% of this study population qualified for not having those major diseases. So 89% had major impairments. The relative risk for flavonoid classes ranged from about a 20 to 30% reduction, and all highly significant. And the food sources of these things were primarily oranges, berries, onions, and apples. So this flavonoid intake between the healthy agers and the usual agers amounted to 24 milligrams a day. And they get that from the USDA food composition database that my agency puts out. We're not that accurate. You know, we don't have the numbers. We give you a mean value. We don't know what we do know something about the variation, but we don't tell you what that variation is. There's no way that you could convince me that a 24 milligram difference, a 7% difference in intake can result in a 20 or 30% relative risk difference 30 years after that baseline measurement. But the healthy agers, you know, they're all nurses, so they're all supposed to be exactly the same, according to my colleagues at Harvard. They have better educated husbands, so I assume they have wealthier husbands. They smoked less, a lot less. They were physically more active. They had less hypertension, less hypercholesterolemia, which is a major risk factor for at least cardiovascular disease. So can we influence healthy aging? Don't smoke. Use your brain, use your muscles. Don't drink too much. A moderate intake of a varied diet, I think, is the strongest evidence we've got at this point. There's a lot of wishful thinking on specific classes of nutrients, specific foods. We need to avoid nutrition deficiencies, particularly in the elderly. There's really limited evidence of benefits of dietary supplements. Dr. Maidani, who's one of our speakers this morning, has shown that nursing home residents who have low blood zinc values are more susceptible to respiratory disease. But there's no compelling evidence for herbals or botanicals, and I think having a good attitude is important. For those of you who are old enough to remember this song from Bobby McFerrin from 25 years ago, "Don't worry, be happy" is good philosophy for everybody, but especially the older folks. I'm going to skip this. This is just here to point out that there are a number of studies trying to find biomarkers of healthy aging, and these are specific fatty acid moieties in the plasma of the middle-aged offspring of people who live to be 90 or more. And it's just a heat map showing correlations of specific fatty acids in sphingomyelin and phosphatidylcholine. And it's really fascinating that there are very, very strong correlations. And of course, correlation doesn't prove cause and effect. So I'm going to sum this up by telling you that despite all the research in this area, the death rate hasn't changed. It's still 1 per person. And we're hoping that blueberries and whole grains and all the right foods will make us healthier, but I'm not sure it's going to make us live a lot longer. So thanks very much for your attention.